Now it's working. Yeah, good morning. A warm welcome again to EASL Congress 2023. It's the last day of our meeting. I hope you all enjoyed it. Now it's really my great pleasure to invite you to this multi-stakeholder session we have today in the morning. It's called the Multi-Society and Multi-Stakeholder Consensus Revision of NAFLD nomenclature, the final results. I think you all have heard about a bit also the complaints also coming from patient communities about this alcoholic definition of a non-alcoholic disease and these negative definitions that were going around, and really to find a way to better find consensus and a good name for this very common disease. So it's a big pleasure for me from EASL to invite our major sister societies with the Latin American Society for the Study of the Liver, ALEH. A big welcome to Graciela Castro-Naro, and a big welcome to AASLD President Nora Terrell. And I would like to hand over to the welcome to Graciela, please.
Thank you, Thomas. Welcome all. I am happy and grateful to be here today on behalf of Latin American Association for the Study of the Liver, celebrating the presentation of the result of the new and historical NAFLD nomenclature consensus, which, since it was thought, was good in itself, but along the way has improved and strengthened after almost 3 years of work. In a pan-society and patient groups, multidisciplinary, robust, inclusive, transparent, open, and without stigma process, in which a panel of experts and researchers contributed with the knowledge and opinions and considered all things. This path was perfect, with scientific and academic discussion, always in a respectful and enriched environment. Next, the long-awaited results of this unprecedented work will be presented. Thanks for joining us.
So it's my pleasure to be here as well. On behalf of AASLD, I want to join my colleagues from their sister societies in saying thank you for being here. This is an important day. We're excited, really, to be part of this process that is bringing us new nomenclature. There is no doubt that this is a global issue. And so it's one of the ways that the societies partner to be able to make change. And so we're very excited that the 3 societies are here today to support and to bring to you this very important next step. Thank you all for coming.
Yeah, thank you very much. So we organized this session that we give you some background information about the whole process, the how and why. And then we have 20 minutes at least, a panel discussion. You know how it works. You can send your questions either via the app, or you can go to the microphone, and I hope we have a lively discussion with our faculty that is quite happy to answer all your questions. So it's my pleasure to invite first Professor Maru Rinella from University of Chicago, and she, together with Phil Newsom, were main proponents and main driver, really bringing all the stakeholders together from all over the world. So Maru, please. Your title is The Why and How.
Yes, thank you very much, Thomas, Nora, and Graciela for the opportunity, and I'm happy to see all of you today. It's been a very long process, and I'm going to walk you through just the basics of the process itself and sort of the impetus for the change. So, as we know, NASH, the coin itself, was coined in 1980 by Irvin Ludwig at the Mayo Clinic, and really nobody believed him. In fact, it ended up getting published finally in the Mayo Clinic proceedings because it was turned down by numerous journals, actually. In 2002, we had the first NAFLD single topic conference, at which point the nomenclature of NAFLD was actually heatedly discussed, and the alternatives were proposed, but then at the end felt that there was really not one particular name that would be better, in a sense. It was in 2020 that in a special issue of Gastro published by Mohammed Aslam, Jacob George, and Arun, they proposed as an alternative metabolic dysfunction-associated fatty liver disease, and really for a lot of very good reasons. So providing an affirmative diagnosis, removing the potential stigma of alcohol, and then recognizing the close relationship with metabolic disorders. And so this was sort of proposed and being mulled over. But very quickly thereafter, there was a definition paper that was published that then did two things that I thought were very important. One was the elimination of steatohepatitis, and two was the allowance of more liberal alcohol use in the definition itself. And several of us thought this would be a problematic change to the definition particularly, and we sort of raised the concern over the validity of the process of the name, but also of the definition change. So we published a couple of editorials and stated our concerns there, and I'm going to walk you through what we did subsequent to that. So what we sought to do is to really go through a proper scientific consensus process where we engaged a broad group of stakeholders to sort of help us sort of come together as a at that point fractured field. So we chose to use a Delphi consensus process, and the most important thing about this is that it has to be informed by subject matter experts. It's conducted using very rigorous methodology. There's anonymity of voting and reporting of results. There's transparency of process. The survey rounds, very importantly, need to be combined with in-person discussion to facilitate consensus building. Why? Because when you have things that are, when you have significant disparity in people's perspectives, you really need to hear and discuss those things that are points of contention. And again, this acknowledges the value of diverse opinions and assures that that viewpoints are considered, even if they don't reach consensus. So we did this initially by using the pan-national liver societies as a starting point, AASLD, EASL, ALEH, the Asia-Pacific Liver Association, and MENA, as well as representatives from the Endocrine Society, patient advocacy groups, and then very importantly, a good methodology group that knows how to do this and has extensive experience in Jeff Lazarus and Diana Romero's group. So overall, we had 264 nominees from these societies, and we weighted it proportionate to association member size. We had 56 countries represented. This is our steering committee, which was an expert group of mostly clinicians. There were patients in here, of course, as well. And this committee met periodically to discuss the progress, to develop the statements, and so on and so forth. So the key questions that we addressed through the steering committee, we were divided into 5 groups. We were meant to first address issues with the current nomenclature. Secondly, discuss the importance of steatohepatitis in disease definition and endpoints for clinical trials. Discuss how what the role should be of alcohol, and if it should be allowed, disallowed, changed in any way. And then how might the name change impact awareness, clinical trials, regulatory pathways, and then is there an alternate name that would help us reduce heterogeneity and, importantly, allow for future advances? So the process went through several rounds. It was actually 4 rounds, voting rounds. You can see there the amount of questions that evolved over time based on feedback. We had over about 3,000 comments that we addressed, categorized, and used to make these changes. We had a consensus conference in Chicago that was facilitated by an independent professional facilitator, and she had us working the entire time in a very active way, interactive both in person and virtual. And then we further discussed the subsequent round of Delphi results at a Pan Society nomenclature meeting in DC at the liver meeting. Oh, that's not supposed to be there, but that's where I'm going to close, and then I'm going to give it over to the next speaker.
Yeah, thank you very much. And as I mentioned earlier, we will have the discussion later on. Hand over to Graciela. Thank you.
The next speaker, Sven Frank, Educational Consilium of the European Association for the Study of the Liver, for the results that the overarching theme and the different diseases under the umbrella. Thank you, Sven.
Yeah, thank you very much. And of course, I have a lot of specific information to share with you. And one of the first things is, as some of you have already seen some of the results, of course, is the issue of the overarching term. Why an overarching term? Now, figure out classical patient, metabolic syndrome, living with obesity, BMI 34, diabetes, dyslipidemia, the full-blown metabolic syndrome, but also drinking 4 or 5 units per day and taking a drug like amiodarone. How do you label his steatosis, steatohepatitis? We can't label it NAFLD, although everybody will recognize that metabolic factors are also implicated in this disease. So that's why we took a little bit a step back and say, okay, we have to look into, if we want to solve that problem of that exclusionary nature of NAFLD, we have to look at all the causes. We're starting from a feature. It's not like viral hepatitis where you have the cause in the name of the disease. We're starting from a feature. Just a little bit like granulomatous hepatitis, although there, of course, it's a more rare entity. And that's why we said, okay, we need to have an umbrella term so that we are always thinking about all the different risk factors for steatosis and steatohepatitis in a given patient, and that we are not overlooking some of the causes that might be present concomitantly. Of course, starting from a feature, yes, but there are 2 main causes, as we all know. That's the metabolic risk factors and the use of alcohol. Now, what is important again, and that's also why it was very relevant to have, for example, our pediatrician colleagues in the panel, is that we also have always to be aware of the other causes. It's not because they are having the metabolic syndrome, especially in children and adolescents, that they cannot have a genetic underlying cause also. So we really need to have a broad view and label the disease exactly as it is with all its risk factors. That does not mean that we are changing the definition or the names of these diseases. I mean, Wilson disease can have steatosis as a feature. Incorporating it under the term of steatotic liver disease does not reclassify the disease. It doesn't change the name of the disease. It doesn't change the definition of the disease. It just wanted to emphasize that if you have a patient with steatosis, steatohepatitis, you have to have in the back of your mind also these diseases as potential causes and not just stop with the first cause that you identify. Why the term steatotic liver disease? The main reason is stigma. There is ongoing research, amongst others by Professor Younossi, looking into the magnitude of the problem of stigma, specifically in NAFLD, and how that impacts on the people living with this disease. But stigma, anyhow, is an issue for a substantial group of people living with this disease. And that is something that we acknowledge that we should take that into account, and why we opted for a more neutral term, getting away from the stigma associated both with fatty and with alcoholic, non-alcoholic. So that's why the overarching term is steatotic liver disease. And here you see a little bit about the methodology, and the different rounds have been mentioned by Professor Rinella, but already in the second round it was clear that we needed to go for an overarching term, that non-alcoholic and fatty were stigmatizing, and in round 3 we ended up with that overarching term of steatotic liver disease. Then the disease is under the umbrella. Again, we have, of course, the 2 main causes, being alcohol and then the factors related to overweight and obesity, and Professor Sagnol will talk later about more specific criteria to define that. But as said, we have many other causes that we need to consider before establishing a final diagnosis of the causes of steatosis and steatohepatitis in a given patient. Now, there are 2 consequences to that. The first one, and I will come back to that, is that several of these causes can be combined. But another consequence is, of course, that you can have a patient in whom there is steatosis or steatohepatitis, and none of these known causes is identified. So you end up with the category of steatosis without a known cause or cryptogenic steatosis. For the time being, it might be in the future that with evolving knowledge, we better can identify, for example, subtle parameters of metabolic derangement or other causes of steatosis, steatohepatitis that are currently unknown. So these patients might be reclassified in the future. We also have to follow them up, of course. So this system allows for that flexibility to incorporate the knowledge that for sure will evolve over the years to come. And so here you have, first of all, under that umbrella term, let's say the single etiology diseases. Alcohol, of course, is a very important cause of steatosis, steatohepatitis. On the other hand, what we were first trying to rename, namely the NAFLD, which is mainly the metabolic drivers of the disease, so that are the two big entities. But then, of course, you have that whole list of less frequent causes that we need to take into account, and that category of cryptogenic steatotic liver disease if you cannot identify any of these causes. And as I said, another consequence is, and now with this new approach we are better equipped to name all these combinations correctly, you can have in a given patient 2 or even more conditions or potential causes of steatosis and steatohepatitis that are combined. Now, of course, we're not going to give a name to any of these combinations, but there is a specific issue with the combination of the two most frequent causes, the metabolic and the alcohol. And what we learned from what evolved after the introduction of the NAFLD concept, as Professor Rinella also explained, is that there's sometimes some confusion. I also reviewed a lot of papers about NAFLD, comparing it to NAFLD. Some of these papers were of excellent scientific quality, but there were also papers that made a confusion, and they said, okay, NAFLD is harboring a worse prognosis compared to NAFLD, but the NAFLD population included patients that were taking alcohol. I even assisted in a conference where they were presenting a new in vitro model of NAFLD, and it was a cell line exposed to both lipids and alcohol. Sorry, that's not NAFLD, it's metabolic plus alcohol. So that confusion creates a problem and also a risk of trivialization of those causes. So that's why the consensus process ended up, and you can see here on the left-hand side, some of the scores of the different questions that were asked to the Delphi panel. But it's clearly acknowledging that if you are consuming alcohol on top of metabolic risk factors, you have a potentially different natural cause of the disease, and this should be acknowledged. And that's why the panel came up with a label for the combined entity of metabolic risk factors and alcohol use, just to acknowledge that we have to look in both of these factors. Of course, for management, there's an area of refinement here. What is the specific contribution? What's the additive effect? What's the synergistic effect? There's a lot of research to do, but at least we should acknowledge that in those patients combining these two risk factors, they should be identified and clearly named. Then, of course, after this exercise with the overarching term and the different diseases under the umbrella, came then the question of how will we rename what we are currently calling NAFLD. And then it was clear that metabolic needed to be incorporated in the name, although about half of the Delphi panel recognized that the term metabolic is a little bit ill-defined, but nevertheless, it's a good indicator of what we are trying to give a name. Another issue was the steatohepatitis. It was clearly recognized by the Delphi panel that there is under the group of patients with steatosis a group that has a more severe form of the disease, where there is not just steatosis, but there is also liver damage and inflammation. Currently, we're defining it by histology. Fine, we might find other ways to define it in the future, but it's the concept of having a liver with inflammation and damage that we call steatohepatitis, and it's an important classifier of disease severity and activity, and it also has prognostic implications, so we need to keep that as a terminology in our approach of the nomenclature. And so, again, coming back to the methodology, here you see that in round 3, oops, I can go back, there was the inclusion of metabolic, and then we ended up with 3 preferred terms that got more or less equal votes. And so there was a final independent subcommittee that came up with the final conclusion. And these are, of course, here. The overarching term steatotic liver disease was already defined in a previous round. For NAFLD being linked to the metabolic risk factors that Professor Sanyal will explain later on, it's metabolic dysfunction-associated steatotic liver disease. The steatohepatitis within that category is the metabolic dysfunction-associated steatohepatitis, so the MASH. And for the category of patients where we really need to acknowledge the coexistence of metabolic risk factors with alcohol, and we should avoid trivializing one or the other, the proposal is to name that category of patients MET-ALD. And of course, again, with this approach, you end up with a category of cryptogenic steatotic liver disease that hopefully we will better understand in the future. Thank you.
Isn't it the patient?
Well, let's go. No. I think I'm sorry, Arun.
Oh,
we
you're
have the
one more?
patient perspective first, sorry.
Yeah. We appreciate we really appreciate your readiness, though, Arun.
Hey,
it's great.
what can I say?
It will be without slides, therefore.
It's my pleasure to introduce the next speaker, Robert Mitchum-Thane, who's Vice Chair of the Liver Patients International, to present on the patient's perspective.
Okay. I have no slides, and those of you with a sensitive disposition will be delighted to hear that I have no more disclosures to make. I have a number of requests. The first request I have is I'm going to ask those of you with any kind of writing apparatus to write your name 3 times on your notes. Anything you have, just if you're on a tablet, if you're on pen and paper, I would ask you please to write your name 3 times on your pen and paper. Come with me on this. Whilst you're doing that, I'm going to thank the chairs and the organizations for the opportunity to be here and to present this bizarre series of requests. So hopefully you're all now, at this moment in time, writing your name 3 times on a piece of paper. Now I know some of you are academics and scientists, it may be a little beneath you, but come with us, humble patients, I ask you. Okay? Come and do this with us. Just write your name 3 times. Now, if I were in a smaller room with not quite so many people, I would say to you, how would that feel? And some of you would go, well, easy, simple, undemanding. What the hell are you asking me to do? Why are we doing this? All of those questions would come up, okay? Now, I'm a humble patient advocate. I don't do science. I don't do any data or anything like that. But I've been told that science is absolutely dependent on corroboration. So now that you've done that once, I'm going to ask you to do it a second time, but this time, use your other hand. Please, just write your name 3 times with your other hand. Take as long as you need, just go through it. Just write your name 3 times. How many thought you were coming to EASL and one of your takeaways from EASL was how difficult it was to write your name on a Saturday morning? Okay? Now, we've done this with clinicians before, and to be honest with you, we couldn't tell which hand was which. I'm not saying that's anything to do with doctors writing, but they're right. So, on a more serious note, if I were to ask you now, how was that experience of writing your name with your other hand? Show of hands, anyone that thought that was challenging, amusing, difficult? Yeah? Okay. Yeah? Slow. Thank you. In 70 seconds, what you have just experienced is change. You've done something different. Change is uncomfortable, challenging, slow. It's all of these things. And yet, today, here we are. So I'm going to ask you to embrace this change. If you're a regulator, I'm going to talk to you about a glass pane that sits within a building. Now, the FDA would call that a window. Here in Vienna, our hosts would call that a fenster. In France and parts of Canada, they'd call it a fenêtre. It's still a glass pane that sits within a building. What you call it doesn't change what it is. I was told this morning that consensus is not unanimous. Of course it's not. In 2023, there are 195 countries in this world. I can tell you now, there are 194 countries that are not happy with the World Cup results. So you know what? Let's rerun the World Cup. So I must apologize to any French people in the room. And this is me as a Scot. We didn't even get to the final committee. So let's not even go there. Okay? Consensus is not unanimous. Maru, you did a wonderful job of encapsulating thousands and thousands of hours. In 2020, when that few doctors made their grand proclamation, and chairs, I would ask you to consider the fact that 2020 doctors still know best. I would maybe propose that as a topic for another presentation. This grand proclamation that it's MAFLD. It's like, really? This started the process. There's nothing we can do about that. That was 2020. That was years ago now. And so it's brought us through this process, and here we are today. If in 2020 the community came to the patient advocates and said, what's the biggest single issue in NAFLD and NASH today? Not one of us. Not Michael, not Roger, not Donna, not Yossi, not Wayne. Not one of us would have said, the biggest single issue facing us is changing the name. Not one of us. But this was imposed upon us, and we as a community had to embrace it. And that we did. So we're here now. Would we, as a patient community, rather that you spent thousands of hours deciding whether it was a window or a fenster? Or would we rather that you spent thousands of hours finding non-invasive technologies, finding drugs that make a difference, finding a way to treat patients as human beings? We can't change the past, but we can change now. So what do you want to do as a community? Do you want to invest another 10, 100, 1,000 hours on this? Or do you want to spend and invest your time in making a difference? We don't all agree. It's not the first topic in hepatology we've not really agreed on, is it? But come on, guys, we need to do better. So I'm asking you to embrace the change. Oh, I nearly forgot. 2020, you could have had your choice. For me personally, the biggest single issue is if you find early NAFLD, tell your patient, because that is their opportunity to make a difference. So please, don't you dare take that choice away from them. Thank you for your attention. Thank you, chairs.
Yeah, thank you very much. So the next speaker is Professor Arun Sanyal from the Virginia Commonwealth University. Please, Arun. Your title is the adult and pediatric definition of MAFLD.
Thank you. Okay, here are my disclosures. So we've already heard about the process that led to this sort of paradigm that is shown on this slide, where under the overarching umbrella term of steatotic liver disease, we have several subcategories, where the one that comes closest to what we used to call NAFLD is now referred to as metabolic dysfunction-associated steatotic liver disease, or MASLD. Now, as one of the authors of that original paper in 2020, if you actually read the paper, the focus primarily was to talk about common pathways and heterogeneity across the population of people that we used to refer to as NAFLD, and particularly the challenges of dealing with varying amounts of alcohol consumption. What we did not expect was that it would take off because it was published in a supplement of gastroenterology. It was not even a main paper per se, but what we did not expect that it would take off like a runaway train. And then, but in any way, I'm really happy to be standing here to say that, it triggered a process to revisit something we had put in place 25 years ago with the original, NIH workshop. And we've now we're getting more clarity. Is this going to be the terminology for the rest of time? Maybe, maybe not. But this is where we are. I think it creates a roadmap for the next decade or two. And so you've seen that we have metabolism-associated MASLD and increased alcohol intake is now considered as a more clarified bucket, and we hope this will stimulate research, particularly focused on this population, because previously they were all mixed in all kinds of categories. We really could not tell what was happening in this population. We thought if you study people who don't consume any alcohol, people who consume huge amounts of alcohol, and then we merge some of the learnings from the two sides, we would know what's going on in the middle. We don't know that. That's the truth. So now this gives us a roadmap to be able to sort that out. You've already heard from Sven about alcohol. We've talked about drug-induced liver injury that can be associated with accumulation of fat. There are monogenic disorders, and there's a host of miscellaneous disorders that also are categorized here. And we also kept a bucket of cryptogenic steatotic liver disease, because sometimes after you go through all these, the patient and the diseases don't read the books. So then you have to still figure out how do you classify them. And as you learn them, people can move from cryptogenic into one of the other buckets. So Sven already covered the Delphi rounds and the factors impacting the name. What I'm going to now focus on is really on the factors impacting the definition. And we've talked about retaining steatohepatitis, but really now I'm going to focus on some of the metabolic parameters and how we classified or categorize them in terms of informing how somebody falls into that bucket of MASLD. Now the process, in the last round, we established a separate 16-member committee, and Vlad Ratzu was the other co-chair with me. There were 13 new members, so it's not like the same set of people kept recycling their own ideas. We got 13 new members, and they covered areas of hepatology, endocrinology, pediatrics, patient advocacy, et cetera. And this led to a fairly robust discussion, and it was an iterative process. It was not a single conversation, multiple conversations. And from the top 3 choices, we came up with a set of recommendations that was then presented to the governing boards of the various societies for further vetting and approval. And having refined the definition, including metabolic parameters, The pediatric committee was further expanded to make sure we had all of the perspectives from those who take care of children with fatty liver disease, or what used to be called fatty liver disease, into consideration. So the criteria we really put together as our guiding principles was that we wanted an affirmative set of diagnostic criteria. And there was near universal agreement to err on the side of being inclusive rather than exclusive, and to minimize patient heterogeneity, and to keep the classification adaptable for future insights, but also bring a synergy with the endocrine community, because many of our patients have cardiometabolic and endocrine comorbidities, which are competing threats to life. And so we need to synergize with them. And of course, the set of criteria for adults was then submitted to a subcommittee of 5 pediatric hepatologists who adapted them for the pediatric population. And there are additional vetting going on with NASPGHAN, and other pediatric communities. So the criteria are here. They will be in the publication. You don't have to memorize all of this today. But the bottom line is, these are very much aligned with the classical landmark paper by Alberti in 2009, which is the skeleton and the framework on which the entire metabolic community sort of has developed. And so we are now aligned with them. So there is a body weight criteria. And we have corrections for Asian phenotypes. We have a glycemic parameter checkbox. We have a blood pressure checkbox. We have a lipid checkbox for triglycerides, and another one for HDL. None of this should be a surprise to anybody. These are classical elements that allow us to align. And we just need one of these, because right now we want to be all-inclusive. We want to just have an idea that if there is excess fat in the liver, that this is somehow linked to an underlying metabolic perturbation. And the pediatric criteria were further refined to make sure that they align with the way pediatricians actually practice, and bringing in things related to the weight percentile based on their age and so on and so forth, so that this is also aligned with how people who take care of metabolic disease in the pediatric population also view all this. The rationale for using a single criteria was that we wanted high sensitivity, and that we thought that if you had 2 or more criteria, which often is used, that it would increase specificity, but then we would leave some people out. And we didn't want to do that, not for the overarching term. Some specific challenges we talked about. What do you do with lean individuals? If there are metabolic risk factors present, then clearly there's not an issue. But if there are no criteria met, one should, A, consider the possibility of monogenic disorders. But if there are no criteria, they could also be classified as cryptogenic. And if subsequent workup indicated that there were metabolic features, they could be reclassified. We debated a lot whether we should have a fasting insulin or a HOMA in there. But our colleagues from the endocrine community brought to our attention that the assays for insulin are notoriously unreliable, and therefore they thought it would create more noise. So we've parked that for now, but this could change down the road. And so basically, this is how you would use it. If somebody has evidence of fat in their liver, there's steatosis, you look to see if there are cardiometabolic criteria. If there are, and there are no other cause of the steatosis, then clearly they have MASLD. And of course, if they also consume alcohol beyond the thresholds that we use to ensure that alcohol is really not a major contributor to the disease, then there is this overlap in the middle over here. And on the other hand, if there are no cardiometabolic features, as you can see over there, that if there are no other causes, then you end up with cryptogenic. And if there is a cause, then you can assign the cause appropriately. So hopefully, this will start bringing a unified approach, not just within the liver community, but across communities with endocrinology, pediatrics, cardiovascular disease, et cetera, because this is affirmative, translatable. We do recognize the overlap with alcohol, and this is a conversation that probably will continue, and the data as it emerges may lead to further refinements. Hopefully, is non-stigmatizing. We did give a lot of attention to the input from all our patients, who are really the reason why all of us are even here and exist. And we can apply this to existing data, and hopefully will be adaptable for clinical trials moving on to the future. So with that, I'll end. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, please. Yeah, please go ahead.
Thank you, Aaron. The next speaker is Professor Philip Newsom, who will present the way ahead. Thank you, Philip.
Thank you very much. And just to echo some of the comments, this has been a huge amount of work for coming up to 300 patients, patient advocacy groups, and healthcare professionals from all over the world. Here we are. So in terms of the way ahead, it really builds on some of the work that's already been taking place. So raising awareness, so iterations of this have been discussed at a number of different fora. So Maru talked about the liver meeting. We also discussed it at the EASL NAFLD summit, really trying to explain the rationale, the process, and progress thus far. Obviously using social media to try and broaden that reach, and a number of editorials to try and explain the rationale. For me, there are and obviously the paper has now come out and should be available in all 3 journals as of this morning. Robert talked about consensus, but I think what we have able to demonstrate from this slide here is over 60, probably approaching 70 plus organizations, patient organizations, healthcare organizations, national, pan-national. So I think, the process has demonstrated that you can't always have your favorite name, but what you can agree on is a process that, you agree on the process and the name. And I think this talks to, the work from many, many different groups and individuals. So to me, there are 3 elements in terms of the way ahead to maximize the opportunities from this. The first is communication. So we've obviously tried hard to communicate within a sort of a broadish set of stakeholders, but the next stage is to go beyond that, to think about the other medical disciplines, primary care, endocrinology, intensive care, acute medicine, et cetera, et cetera. Also, we've approached many journals, but there are a myriad of other journals there. So it's letting them know that there is a process, that we think a robust process that's gone through all of this, so they can understand the value of unity when it comes to having a term. But as you can see here, there's a range of other stakeholders, allied health professionals, government, and the public. So this is work that, collectively as a field we need to do to broaden awareness. The second thing is some of the formalities, and these things take time and effort. So, discussions with, for example, the World Health Organization, so that we can talk through the new name and how we get this embedded within, the official ICD nomenclature. We've been having discussions with the FDA and the EMA, but it's moving forward to that next stage with them. The reality is that these changes have no impact on the regulations around biomarkers and therapies. The only impact they may have is that they increase awareness, increase involvement and engagement, and has been touched on with the new group of individuals who we see commonly, people who have metabolic risk factors and drink above the previous recommended limits. It's an opportunity to actually better understand that cohort, better understand how therapies might work in those groups. And that's particularly relevant when we think about some of the new agents, which not only impact on eating, but they also impact on individuals' desire to drink. And then similarly working with industry, and we're working closely with the forum as well as industry more broadly to sort of reassure people and see how this is an opportunity. And I think the story with PBC is a nice example of how companies were initially reticent but actually embraced it and have seen the benefits of moving forward with a nomenclature which actually is clearer and less not stigmatizing, but in the sense of PBC, it removed that fear when in many cases it wasn't warranted. So then the third element, I think, are the research opportunities. So Scott Friedman gave a fantastic talk on, was it Wednesday now, talking about, within MASLD, we can look at, different types of phenotypes that might sit within there, microbiome dependent, insulin resistant dependent, lipogenic. So this system, this structure allows for new knowledge and flexing within that, the role of polymorphisms. I've talked about meta-ALD, and I appreciate there's a lot of discussion and concern around, what this means about alcohol. I think what we're trying to conceptualize is this notion that there are individuals where both factors are at play, and depending on where you are within that spectrum, there'll be different contributions. And what we need to understand as a community is how we operationalize that. Of course, individuals will flex within that over a lifetime. How do we capture alcohol intake, recognizing that it's self-reported in the main? And then within steatotic liver disease, Arun touched on things like lean NASH. How do we better understand those phenotypes? So I think there are opportunities in multiple dimensions, and it really is beholden on us as practitioners, patients, and advisory groups to make the most of that. So thank you very much, and look forward to the discussions.
Thank you, Phil. We're going to move now to the panel discussion. And in preparation of that, we're going to invite a few others up to the stage. Julio Berman, who's the Vice President for the European Liver Patients Association. Alexander Krog, who's a Professor and Head of Hepatology at the University of South Denmark and President General of EASL. And Jeff Lazarus, Professor of Global Health and well known for the Health Systems Research Group that he leads. And then Veronica Miller from the University of Berkeley, who many of us know from Forum. And we would encourage you, if you have questions, this is now your opportunity. So if you want to just step to the mic, we'd be very happy to entertain questions on the part of the panel. Please, we are, wanting to get to as many as possible. So short questions if you can. So start at the microphone 2, please.
Yeah, I'm Ashish. I'm from India. So my question is, if the patient is of alcoholic liver disease, and suddenly once in the morning he wakes up and he finds his HbA1c over 5.7, so immediately he would move from ALD to met-ALD, and with the control of sugar within 2-3 months, he'll again keep on switching between ALD and met-ALD. So what's the way forward?
Maybe I can take a stab at this. So when you say somebody has ALD, you need to first be sure that this is someone who is consuming enough alcohol that we attribute the primary driver of the disease to be alcohol. If that does not change, the development of they may have a metabolic contributor, but their disease is primarily being driven by the alcohol consumption if they're consuming 80, 100 grams of alcohol per day. And so that patient will continue to remain in the ALD category, and the A1C becomes, something that you can identify as a risk stratification factor if you're doing a treatment trial, but you don't reclassify that patient. It is only for the individuals, who consume above the cutoffs that we say that alcohol is really probably not a significant contributor to the disease development or progression, but not enough to say that alcohol is the primary driver of the disease, who fall into that middle category. So really do not envision people just bouncing all over the place. That's a very theoretical construct.
And as this is a nomenclature conversation, I'd like to thank you for your question on alcohol-related liver disease.
Yeah, Ramon.
Hi. Thank you for giving me this opportunity. I have 2 comments. One is the best comment that I heard in the Chicago meeting was a pediatrician. She told why I have to talk to a child that has a fatty liver disease and use the word fat and alcohol to a child. Why I have to use these 2 words to a child with a disease? Number one thing. And I remember I tweeted that, and it was greatly. The second thing about this, the predominance. I'm really happy that met-ALD has a name, because hepatitis B and C, you have both, you need a name. But to me, probably the predominance has to be refined with new data, okay? And probably this definition of what is the predominance, we're a little afraid, the ALD, that you underestimate the alcohol in many patients, okay? Thank you.
Yeah, please, Phil.
I think that's a very good point, and I think we specifically stayed away from trying to categorize within that, and I think that is the next phase of work that we need to do with the community to see how we operationalize that. But your point's well taken.
Maybe microphone number 4.
Good morning, Sebastián Marciano from Buenos Aires, Argentina. I'm happy with the results and to have participated in the process. Just one comment about the translation of some terms. Maybe some of them would not be exactly translated, for example, among different countries that speak the same language. For example, metabolic dysfunction associated with steatotic liver disease might not have a single word to be translated into Spanish. So there might be some addendum or something to say, if you're Spanish speaking, we suggest this term, so that there are not so many terms in the same language.
Just to comment on that too, so that's a very good point. So I would envision that instead of saying estatosis hepática no alcohólica, you would say estatosis hepática metabólica, no?
Exactly.
So that would be, I mean, I think that it would flex very easily, not for all languages, of course, but for the Romance languages, I think it would pretty easily.
It's important for the patients as well, because they get in contact around the world and they speak different kinds of the same language.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Microphone number 2.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. I'm Jeff McIntyre, patient rep and vice president of the Global Liver Institute. I'm going to read from my notes here just to make sure I'm clear on the points I wanted to make very quickly. I want to particularly thank the committee, Dr. Ranella, Dr. Newsom, Dr. Sanyal, Dr. Frank, Dr. Lazarus, everyone involved here for their continued work. I really appreciate, especially early in the process, that the petition that surfaced advocating that the name be changed to NAFLD without further discussion was put aside in favor of the much more appropriate Delphi process. Robert made that point earlier. I have been a participant in the Delphi process and involved in the discussion throughout. I'd like to state publicly that I voted no throughout this process and disagree with the changes and the outcomes presented. It is important that it is realized while this has been a consensus, it is not unanimous, especially among patients, a point that Robert and I discussed prior over coffee this morning going in. It's also important to note that this is not a process that has been driven by liver patients. While patient organizations have been held up prominently and displayed as endorsers or participants, such as in the EASL studio broadcast on Thursday, patients were in the vast minority of those included. If I'm correct in my understanding of the Delphi process, with 74% of participants being clinicians, patients were not needed to reach the 66% supermajority threshold for approval, with or without us. Now, I'm happy to discuss and listen to anyone that may hold a different perspective, but much like Robert said earlier today, I realize it does not change where we have arrived at today. I am concerned the consequences of this change have not been vetted appropriately and respectfully request that an impact analysis and a report be done by an independent third party, such as a McKinsey or Deloitte, as part of the implementation process to fully understand the economic implications and significance of the timing on the field and on patient treatment. On the heels of Global Liver Institute's NASH patient-focused drug development meeting for the FDA and at the following NASH tag, at that point, the FDA stated that any change in definition would require all biomarkers to be revalidated against the new definition or stratification as used here.
I'm sorry, it could be a co-speech, so I think your points are well taken, and I would like to hand over perhaps to Jeff and Veronica.
I will sum my comments up then this way and say, in conclusion, I am asking that the AASLD, EASL, and ALEH representatives today publicly commit to an independent third-party impact analysis as part of the implementation. And I don't ask without giving. GLI was a part of the steering committee as well, and so we certainly offer our leadership to help guide this as we also participate in this steering committee. And let me say thank you. We greatly respect the work you're doing. We see this as an important part of that.
Thank you very much.
Two very quick comments, and then I would open it to Jeff and Veronica. So with respect to the definition change, it is an affirmative definition, but it's not a change from the population, and we looked at this specifically. So the population that's covered in this particular process is actually not different at all. In fact, all it does is operationalize what goes through your mind as a clinician when you see a patient that you're considering to have this. So it really doesn't change the definition. It will not change NITs or the regulatory space. There would be no reason for that to happen. With respect to patient involvement, you may or may not be aware that we left it completely open. And we would have been happy to have 200 patients, actually. But we went to great lengths, and it took several phone calls and reaching out to get as many representatives as we could, and we were limited only by the people that came forward. And that's honestly it, because we would have been happy to have as many as were willing to participate. There was no ceiling on that at all. But anyway, Jeff, maybe.
Sure, I'll just make a quick comment. Thank you, Jeff, for raising that. I mean, in any consensus, as Robert mentioned earlier, and as we know, there will be those who don't agree, and that's something we chose this process in order to also share where there is that disagreement, so that we can move the field forward. I would just echo what Maru said. When we reached out to the patient groups, we took everyone that was proposed and nominated to join, and there was actually space for more. And I think that's a real message, that we need to continue to strengthen patient advocacy groups so that even more of you have a voice and can engage in processes like this. I mean, now we have a consensus, and I think we need to work together on how to move the field forward. There'll be all kinds of impact assessments, there'll be studies, there'll be continued head-to-head comparisons, but we've agreed, as a field, that these are the new names, the new definitions, and we need to look, I think, forward on how we're going to work together, so that you can also work with the patients that you're serving, and explain really what MASLD is and what it means to them, and we can move on from sort of the continued discussion on the name change. The other comment I would make is that although there was a smaller proportion of patients, the majority of patient representatives did vote for this change.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So we're going to move on. Thank you. Thank you very much. Microphone number 51.
Do you want to?
Oh,
Yeah,
I'm sorry, Veronica.
I'll just make some quick comments here. And I think I was part of the process as well. So first of all, I want to congratulate Maru and Philip for the amazing job that you did, and for everyone that participated, Jeff, your leadership as well. So it's difficult when you come up with a change like this, but I think having this consensus that we can now take to the industry, the regulatory agencies around the world, and really, start implementing it in the drug development process. And I agree with Maru that the definition itself hasn't really changed, because people drinking some alcohol have been included in clinical trials. So it's not really a major shift in patient populations. And I think it really helps to delineate, first of all, acknowledge that there is that middle group, and then clearly delineate the alcohol-related liver disease, because that drug development path will be different. So anything the Liver Forum can do to support the implementation, we'll be happy to do.
Should we go for? So microphone 4, please.
Yes, Philippe Mathurin from Lille. I think there is no consensus with regard to the MET-ALD definition, because we need to look on data. We already have data showing that the alcohol-related liver disease, in terms of fraction of mortality, is 10 times higher in this mixed population. So I think that we need to rely on data before changing terminology, and I'm quite uncomfortable with the proposition of MET-ALD. You put on the umbrella of the lower risk the definition of the disease which is associated with higher risk. In addition to that, moderate drinking has never been considered to 20 to 30 to 50 grams. This is heavy drinking as compared to the WHO. So again, this is very important to consider. And in addition, this MET-ALD, a significant proportion of those patients already have alcohol use disorders that has been completely taken off this definition. So I think we need to be very prudent. I share the fact that you want to change the terminology. I accept that, but I think that there is no consensus with regard to this issue.
Yeah, who wants to?
Do we have anybody on the panel?
So, Philippe, I think, thank you for that comment. I think you raise a very important issue. But as you know, there's been a tremendous paucity of data for people who consume sort of alcohol in that range and who also have multiple metabolic risk factors relative to people who have very high levels of alcohol consumption, over 60 to 80 grams per day, or people who have 0 to 20. Your point is very well taken, that if you take people who are obese and consume alcohol have significantly greater rate of outcomes and progression compared to those who are just obese. But I think what this does, it's not meant to be a static definition, but it creates a way for us to move forward so people can start generating more data so that in the future we can continue to refine. So we're not really that different. I think we're not that. Conceptually, we're just coming at it in a way to create a roadmap as opposed to saying this is some sort of a God-given truth, that this is an area that will continue to get refined.
Aaron, this is not true. You know that. There is data in the population level with regard to the risk of death according to the threshold. And as you already know, in the population, it's already accepted that. You don't consider another thing which is important. I am a lean guy. I'm drinking more than 20 grams because I'm associated with a risk of liver death. If I'm becoming obese, the risk of having a severe liver disease is increasing, but just it's no more called an alcohol-related liver disease. This is a very important concern. You cannot say it's not important. You know that. Don't say that there is no data with regard to the
I said
level.
There's a paucity of data. The English language clearly has a definition for the word paucity. But anyways, we are not...
In a Lancet population of 1 million of patients, it's not positive. You cannot say that.
It's not been trivialized.
Philip, I think your point is well taken.
Yes.
We are already overriding a bit, and I would like to give the others also a chance, and perhaps we can discuss afterwards. And of course, it will be an important point for the future, but we can perhaps move forward. Brief questions and answers. Microphone 2, please.
Yes. I hope so. I'm a bit short, but I hope you can hear me. Hello, my name is Tove Frisch, and I'm here on behalf of ELPA. But in this case, I don't speak on behalf of ELPA. I speak just as myself. I also ask you to forgive me if this has been said. My hearing is terrible after my ribavirin days, but I don't think so. I just want to say one thing which is very important. If this stigmatizing process with non-alcoholic is so bad for people with NAFLD, it is just as bad for people with NASH. So if we are going to change the names, we have to change both. Otherwise, it's completely pointless. Thank you very much.
Sven, Frank?
Yeah, that's also what we did. So it's the NAFLD has changed in MASLD, and NASH has also changed in MASH. So that was really taken into account yet. It's good, but it's a great point.
Last question, microphone 2, please.
Thank you. So I'm Juan Pablo Ara from Canada. In first place, I want to congratulate everyone and thank you for this huge work, all the steering committee. I think this is a step forward for the field. I recognize that it's probably not perfect and we need to refine some things, but I think at least gave us a framework to work in the future. So congratulations everyone and thank you very much. My question probably for Jeff or Phil is how do you envision the implementations in terms of registries like ICD-10 codes or for this disease, how we can capture that and improve the awareness in the future first, especially for the primary care? Thank you.
So thank you, Juan Pablo, and thanks for your participation. So this is incredibly important. We've raised the issue with WHO, and there will be follow-up meetings. Last month, we had an opportunity to have a side event to the World Health Assembly with directors from the World Health Organization. It was hosted at the EASL headquarters, but all the associations were present. So we raised the issue that they know that the nomenclature change was happening. Now they'll know that it's happened. And changing ICD is a long process. So there will be multiple meetings set up with the proper authorities, basically, at WHO, but that also needs to be happening with the FDA, with the EMA, with regulators at the national level, health technology assessment groups, and so on. So we'll really need a lot of people involved in that process, but I think the associations will lead on engaging with WHO.
Robert, you want to give a very short comment?
Just one tiny little thing, and this is about the second branch, the people that have metabolic liver disease, but they also have this alcohol part. For me as a patient advocate, I think it's vital that these people are now seen. Not only have they been underserved, not only have they been under-recognized, but they've been invisible. And now we have a way to find, to define, and to treat these people. And that is absolutely enormously important.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I want to conclude this session and really thank the major sister society, AASLD, ALEH, and of course, all the people that worked within EASL to make this possible. I think for me, I really like this way of thinking that help us to better categorize a very common issue. And for me, a kind of a quite revealing element was what you have seen with a positive phase 3 trial with resmetirom. And perhaps you noticed that they only included patients having 3 metabolic risk factors. And by having a better definition, perhaps, of the patient group included than just NAFLD, all comers, they were able to have a positive phase 3 result. And I think this helps. And I think it's a reality that many of our patients have comorbidities. And I fully agree with the alcohol people like Ramon and Philippe Mathurin that, of course, what is the relative contribution have to be explored. And for me, it would be very interesting, you know, if you have a patient with comorbidities, elevated ALT, and he stops drinking, still biochemical parameters were high, and you see a progression, then, of course, most likely a metabolic issue is the main driver, and it could be the opposite. You know, if everything normalized, you perhaps know that alcohol was the main driver. So we have to learn, but it gives us something to work on, and I think it's a great opportunity. We have to depend also on the reality of our patient, and I think this is quite well reflected, and further refinement is very much welcome. But now we have a matrix, a roadmap where we can do this. So thanks really for the panel. It was a 3-year work, and as they all mentioned, this is consensus-driven. It's not only a personal opinion. Great work, thanks a lot, and I will see next year what will be the outcome of this endeavor. Thank you very much.